So today's principle, and I think it's very much related to the one we had last week, X law. Today's principle is on oro vacui, which is a Latin expression for the fear of empty space. So oro vacui really describes this preference, this tendency that many of us share of favoring filling blank spaces with objects and things over leaving them blank or empty. And this is actually a bit of a tendency, a bias that all of us kind of share to a certain degree. This was actually, the name itself, oro vacui, was applied by Italian art critic Mario Prats when he was actually talking about the interior design during the Victorian age, right? And again, as I explained, it comes from Latin, right? It means the fear of empty space. You can also refer to this as kenophobia, right? Which comes from Greek and also means the fear of the empty. So you can see oro vacui, right? This tendency of filling blank spaces, right? The fear of leaving them blank. Of course, in art, right? That's how, in many ways, it started by this art critic criticizing art and interior design. And there's countless examples of that in this specific domain. You know, if you look at some medieval manuscripts, you also see a huge tendency for oro vacui to really come forward. And you see these immensely detailed illustrations, and they are really trying to fill every single small detail of that page, right? Not leaving anything blank. But here, you can also apply oro vacui as a tendency, as a principle, also applies to other aspects of human life. I think all of us have probably went through the process of buying a brand new bookshelf, and in the matter of a few weeks, it got filled and stuck with things we didn't even know existed or had it at home, right? So in a very short amount of time. And likely it's not going to look so pretty as the magazine sort of shots that you see in this particular slide. It's normally a lot messier than this. You can also apply, of course, the law of oro vacui to window displays, right? And this is in fact being the target of a really interesting research study that they did that really gave us an interesting insight on oro vacui, and which I'm going to explain right now. So they proved, in many ways, this is somehow of a preliminary research sort of insight, but it really proved that there's a general inverse relationship between oro vacui and value perception, which means that as oro vacui increases, right, as our tendency of filling blank spaces with things increases, right, the perceived value and prestige of that experience, of that location, of that object, of that product tends to decrease, right? A great example of this is if you think about Chinatown, right? If you go to most shops in Chinatown today in New York, where I'm talking at the moment, you go into one of these window shops, right? And they are filled with things, right? So immediately, what is the perception that you have of that particular store, right? That they probably sell cheap products, right? You don't really associate that with prestige necessarily. Now, on the opposite hand, let's say you walk just a few blocks north to Fifth Avenue, right? And it's the opposite, right? Many shops, window shops and window displays in Fifth Avenue, they have just a handful, a couple of items on display, right? So what is the perception there, right? You associate that with high value, with price, right? With expensive things, right? With prestige, right? So now we can see how oro vacui plays with value perception in such a way, which is a really interesting thing. And you can actually apply this dichotomy into other elements of design, such as websites, okay? So I'm not saying necessarily that Yahoo is similar to a shop that you might find in Chinatown, but it is definitely interesting to look at this, especially after the session we had last week on X law. And this is, of course, already an outdated version of Yahoo. But when you look at this page, there's a lot of things screaming for attention, right? And it's really hard to see what is the main task here, because you're kind of overwhelmed with options, overwhelmed with information, right? So this is And the perception might be that this is not so much of a sophisticated sort of premium type of experience, right? In opposition, and this is one of the few slides I had for Google, I promise. When you look at this, right, it's the perception that you get is the opposite, right? By the cleanliness itself, it resembles this type of experience you might find on the window display of Fifth Avenue shop, right? So you look at this, and immediately the perception is that it's modern, it's fresh, it's simple, it's elegant, right? So you associate with all these values by simplicity alone, which, of course, in fact, explains why so many designers, so many of us are really obsessed with white space, right? So if for all the designers on the audience right now, Oro Vacui is your principle. Whenever you mention white space, you have to think about Oro Vacui. And of course, as the great architect Van der Rohe explained once, less is more, right? In the case of the Google homepage, and there's, of course, many research has been written on this, less is more. Now, what's interesting is that, and again, in the vein of X law that we discussed last week, less is more, but not always, right? And if you saw the talk by Malcolm Gladwell, right, on the different sort of kinds of tomato sauce, of spaghetti sauce, you really understand that less can be more, but at times it's not, okay? So what I would say, I would caveat with the following, that not every product is the same, okay? And less can be more, but it's complicated, right? Take it with a grain of salt. And I'm going to show you an example of this, how not every product is the same. This was actually part of a Medium post that product designer Nini Mystery that works for Guild put up, I think, a few years back. And basically, she showed two comps of the product that she was working on. And basically, there was a before and after. The before, you can see on the left, was a really clean, sort of modern, sophisticated type of experience, which you might even associate with the Google example before, right? Very clean, a lot of white space. So there was a low incidence of Oro Vacui, right? And there's a before, right? A different sort of comp, which is the opposite, right? It almost looks like a really complex table. It's like a spreadsheet filled with information, a lot of data points, right? It's Oro Vacui, right? It's one of those examples we saw from ancient manuscripts trying to fill every single empty space that was there. So what's interesting here in this particular execution is that it was the second version that proved a lot more effective, right? The after version performed better in terms of engagement, in terms of conversion, and overall time to complete the task. And we're going to get back to this example in short. But you might think, especially those of you that have been involved in data visualization, which is a kind of a sibling of some of the principles we are been talking about. Data visualization is really all about going deep on Oro Vacui, right? Filling spaces with things, with data that can be meaningful in terms of understanding causality, in terms of like comparing items, right? You really need to arm the user with insights through data so that they can actually arise to a certain conclusion, all right? So even if we look at some of the classic examples of data visualization, right? Considered one of the best graphics ever created by Edward Tufte, this map of the French invasion of Russia in 1812 by Charles Minard, you notice it's taking a good amount of space, right, to really explain this really intricate and complex process of Napoleon's march. And in fact, you can argue that the reason why this chart is so effective is that it really leverages some of the principles that Edward Tufte put together on what makes a successful information graphic, right? It's the ability, of course, to show comparisons, right, between data. It's really the important part of showing causality, all right, understanding how they are related. It's, of course, employing multivariate data, right, multivariate data sets, right, so that you can actually combine, and it allows the user to actually make better judgment, right, on an otherwise complex narrative. And then finally, one of my favorites, which is the integration of evidence, right? Incorporating various modes of information, right? Text, maps, calculation, diagrams, etc., to show evidence of source, right? data to findings. So the more, I like to think about this as ammunition that you provide to the user, right? So that they can actually start balancing out the pros and cons, really trying to understand the full comprehensive picture of this system, right? So now these are great principles, right? But in many ways, they kind of contradict the idea of simplicity, right? The idea of sustaining yourself from going deep into aura vacui and filling empty spaces with stuff. So I think the dilemma we have here is, how can we actually strike a balance between emptiness and fullness, right? Between visual simplicity, like the case you saw with the Google homepage, and information density, right? This is a really tough challenge. So how can we actually strike a balance between these two things? Well, it might seem like a cliche, but I always go back to this, and so should you. It's always about understanding users, their context, and the task at hand, right? So users and the task that they are trying to fulfill. And I'm going to go back to the example that I was mentioning before, right? So again, this is a product designer who actually made a Medium post. By the way, I can actually share all these links with you, so don't worry about annotating or grabbing screen grabs of this. So the product designer tested these two different experiences, and the right one was a much more successful one, right? According to various different metrics. As it turns out, and this is again where users and tasks come from, as it turns out, the customers of that specific experience that she was designing for were mostly business developers who came from finance or consulting background and spent endless hours in worksheets and slides. This is what they know the best. It's a type of environment where they excel, right? No pun intended, but it's their favorite type of interface, right? So for them, this is basic. This is very understandable. So understanding the users was one, but then also understanding the task that she was designing for, right? This was actually not something that they would do, once a week or once a day. This was actually a very repetitive task. And the second design, this one that you see here, removed the need for users to click to learn more, right? Because as you saw in the example before, those beautiful cards, very simple, very elegant, were great, but you always had to click to know more information, at least one click away. While in this, you could actually oversee the whole thing. Now, this specific execution removed the need for users to click to learn more, right? They could also make decisions by quickly scanning the information before even clicking further. Right? At a glance, they could just see the whole data set related to the specific people that were listed in that spreadsheet, right? So this, again, understanding the types of users that you are designing for, understanding this task, right? Understanding how this is actually a very repetitive task that they do several times in a single day. So minimizing the time, right? Minimizing the sort of number of clicks, and make it really easy to scan across a variety of different data points. This is why this solution was the more effective one, right? Now, having said that, information density should never be an excuse for bad design, okay? And this is something that you should really be cognizant of. It's never an excuse for bad design. And in fact, there's this beautiful article that I will send you the link afterwards, that says very, very, in a very sort of pristine way, that it's not about information density, but hierarchy. It's really about information hierarchy, right? Because many times you say, hey, our users want more information. They need that for, a given task. So that opened up a can of worms, because all of a sudden, everything is allowed, and aura vacui takes control, right, over that experience, right? But it's not so much about information density. It's really about hierarchy. And even the most complex, demanding UI can be balanced if you apply the right principles. So what are some of these principles? And we're going to cover these in detail in future sessions. But there's, of course, the idea of hierarchy, which is implicit to how you can actually use shape, size, color, highlighting, layout options to actually prioritize the things that matter, right, in this particular interface. Prioritize the things that matter to the task at hand, right? So that's one. The other one is the serial position effect that we're going to be talking at some point in the future. Really interesting principle that basically tells us that any list whatsoever, or in most cases, you tend to remember the elements that are on the beginning of that list and in the end of that list. So again, prioritizing those elements in an effective way is part of what makes great design. And then, of course, the 80-20 rule, we briefly mentioned that last week, is really about understanding the 20% of the features that are used by the majority of users, right? So most products might have countless features, hundreds of features. But normally, according to the 80-20 rule, around 20% of those features are used by roughly 80% of the users, right? So identifying that short number of features, the top most prominent features, and how to design them properly, right? How to make them more effective, more easily to click, more easily to find. That should be a priority of the 80-20 rule. And we're going to cover that in detail in future sessions. Also, a few related principles that you should consider. Chunking. This is a great principle that I love so much because it goes back to the Middle Ages, right? This is the principle of dealing with complexity by chunking, by grouping smaller items into things that are more digestible, okay? And you can actually see chunking applied in many areas. Just any credit card uses this principle. Any phone number that you have uses this principle, right? Because it's easier for us to remember 4 digits at a time than it is for us to remember a long string of 16 digits, right? And the same thing applies to mobile phones, right? It's the idea of chunking into smaller, more digestible parts. Progressive disclosure, it's very similar to chunking, right? A great principle that applies to interaction design and data visualization. It allows you to actually progressively display information as users need, right? So instead of bombarding them with everything all at once, okay? It's a great principle, and we're definitely going to approach this one at a future date. And then direct manipulation is a great principle also of simplicity, that it removes the need of controls, filters, and Chrome that can really clam a lot on a given interface, and allows users to directly manipulate, directly act upon the data, right? Content, which is a really enticing experience. And of course, mobile over the last 10 years has really explored the notion of direct manipulation to a great degree. So these are some of the principles that we're going to cover in the future. This marks the end of this interesting discussion on Vacui. If you haven't actually seen this Wikipedia page, I highly encourage you to do so. It's one of my favorite Wikipedia pages. It's called the List of Cognitive Biases, that goes into many of these some universal biases that we all share, and many others that are immensely interesting. So it's really a treasure trove of information if you are keen on knowing more about the human brain. So I really thank you so much for being here, for attending this live session. The best way for you to be notified of future events is by following me on Twitter, the MSLima, MSLIMA. You can look me up on Twitter and just follow me so that you get notified of future events like this and others that I might end up doing in the future. Manuel S. Lima is actually my name on YouTube. I just kicked off a channel, and I'm actually going to start putting all of these videos on YouTube. For those on the call now live, I'm also sending you an email with a lot of the links that we discuss, and many, many more actually, and a link to the YouTube channel playlist so that you can actually subscribe. For those who are new to this interface, and this is your first time with me in this webinar, you can actually see a little green button on the top that says follow. I also encourage you to follow me here on Crowdcast. As soon as an event goes live, you're going to be notified by email, and you can actually jump into it straight away. So it's a really great way of, again, being notified and updated of new forthcoming events on this and other topics. I have a lot of things planned down the line, from interviews to panels and interesting stuff of that nature. So if you are keen on following, please do so. And here I open the floor for questions from the audience. And this could be related to this Vacui, right? Why we love and should embrace white space. with a caveat, and also even related to the discussion we had last week on X-Law, because they are certainly related, the two of them. I'm just going to minimize here. Awesome. Thank you so much. So let me see. So again, I've asked you to ask the question for this QA. It's the best way. The chat can be a bit messy at times. It can get a little bit overwhelming. But if you use the ask a question, that's probably the best one. You can, again, pose a question there or even vote on questions so that we can actually start tackling those. All right. When you talked about the shop example, it was extracted from a book. What was the name of it? That's great. Great question, Marco. Yes, it's actually part of a study they did a few years back. And I will happily, let me actually see. I think I had it open here. Again, I will follow up with an email that has many of these links and others. It's actually from a study done in 2007, and it's called Visualizing Emptiness. A very appropriate title. So I'm just going to put it here on the chat so that you guys have access to it. And again, I'm going to follow up with many other links pertaining to this, okay? So that was a question from Marco. A question from Ahmed asks, how would you compare minimalism to simplicity or their interrelation, the balance between simplicity and refinement of design alongside sufficient information presented? That's a tough one. And I need to mention something that, I was actually thinking about putting these two caveats on the slides itself, but I think it would be better for the discussion. So minimalism, yes, I could have definitely added a few slides on minimalism. Of course, I had a quote by Mies van der Rohe, but I could include, from industrial design objects, from, interior design, from architecture that really express this sort of new idea that less is more, right? This idea of simplicity and minimalism, right? So I would say two things. One of them is that ora vacui, and this is, again, an important principle, but I think every principle is important for us to take it with a grain of salt, that it's not, again, it's a principle because it's not a hardcore ingrained rule, right? You always need to debate the logic of using this and applying this. One of the things about ora vacui is that it seems like it is cyclical, right? So ora vacui emerged that, when the concept was born in the Victorian age, Baroque, Georgian areas, there was a sign of affluence, right? The sign of affluence was more, right? You go to the Baroque, you go to this old sort of styles that we had from architecture design. It was the very opposite of minimalism, as of course we all know. But that was what was associated with affluence. Now, in a time where all that surrounds us is more, where we are overwhelmed with things, right? Going back to X-Law, we perceive the opposite, that less is better. And less all of a sudden became associated with true affluence, right? The example of the shop display at Fifth Avenue, right? Now, this might be cyclical. Who knows that in 50 years, in 100 years, maybe we're going to go back to the Baroque or to the Victorian era, right? Where, again, then the sign of affluence is actually more again. It might well be the case. It seems like ora vacui and the understanding of that, sort of the inverse relationship between ora vacui and value perception, right, is probably the case right now as we are going still through this phase of minimalism, right? But it could also change. No one really knows. And then the second thing is it could be also culture specific. Okay, so even we have our different sort of acceptance of what is too much. Okay, even between you and I, for example, Ahmad. But it's also this idea that less is more might be more of an Occidental type of mentality, right? When we look at our users and we understand that, the less is more might not be applied to every culture, every country, every group of people around the world. So I would say take this with a grain of salt, that it might be cyclical, this idea of ora vacui being inverse to value perception. It might be cyclical, and it could actually be culture specific. It might not apply to every single group of people around the world. So those two things I would mention as part of this. Let me think. How would you compare? Balance between simplicity and. So, how would you consider the relation between ornamental flourishes and or vacui when it's too little, sometimes depending on the context of design? You may want to design it in a particular design language. Example, if you are doing a historical visualization of a particular area, this might be visualized in a particular way. When it's or vacui could bad treat. Well, I think I went through that, Ahmed, in the presentation, right? I think, again, if you are trying to create an experience that you want to associate with being modern, sophisticated, that you might even charge a higher price. Again, in this current moment in time, minimalism is probably the best way to go, right? Following that example that we saw from Google, the example we saw from that shop in Fifth Avenue, right? Doesn't apply to everything, but that could be definitely a direction for you to consider. And then of course, or vacui can be good, right? If that's what's the best for the user for the task that they need, right? Sometimes, and you look at examples, I've dealt with a lot of really advanced users on let's say on dashboards, hardcore engineers that have these dramatically intense dashboards. They have to evaluate a variety of different metrics and be notified and having alerts and all that. And the same thing applies for financial data analysts, right? So it's information density is really important for them, right? In the sense that they need to understand everything that's going on. They need to understand, make comparisons, understand causality, some of the things that we talked. So in that case, or vacui might actually be the best design. Sometimes or vacui is good, right? It really depends on you understanding the user, right? The brand, what you're trying to do with the brand, but also the users, what they want, and the task that they are trying to perform for a given product. Paulo, how's it going? Paulo asks, how do you make sure simplicity, the less, doesn't reduce too much the complexity of the phenomenon you are trying to represent, mediate? That's a great question. Yes, because it can, right? I mean, it's a really tough balance. And again, we go back to this the example that I showed of this the before and after of the product, right? And if you recall, they had this really interesting sort of very clean person cards that we might associate with a phone book of some sort. But those were really simple, right? But they probably didn't have enough information that they needed. That information was lying somewhere else. And again, this is another example of progressive disclosure, right? But they had to click to find more information, right? It might actually, that's a case where it might have been okay for that specific behavior if this was something that they used on an irregular basis, right? If you used this particular experience, let's say once a week, maybe it's okay, right? You just need at a glance and then you click. But by the law of progressive disclosure, when you need more information, or you have the overview, and then you have the details on demand when the user asks for it. Okay. But as it turned out, right, this was actually a very repetitive task that he did several times, sometimes even in one single hour. So that was just a waste of time for them, right? So again, that's the problem of when you make things too simple, you have to hide them somewhere, right? You are intentionally hiding. There's a two problem, is that you are intentionally hiding, and they still might be accessible, but they are a few clicks away, which means time for the user, right? And then sometimes the worst case is if you actually remove those details altogether, because that you incapacitate the user, right, from truly understanding what's at stake here, okay? But again, I always go back to this, even in some cases, some of that information is not relevant. You really understand, when you are dealing with really complex data sets, is all this information relevant to the user? Do they really need all of these data points to make any judgment? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It really depends on the task that they're trying to achieve, right? So I think it's fine if we actually remove things, right? Both from a data set point of view, but also from an interface point of view, depending on the task, depending on what the goal is, what they are trying to achieve. I think I read all of the questions now. Let me see. There's one here by Natalie. Maybe it also has to do with exclusively of goods they sell at boutiques versus Chinatown stuff. Yes, of course. definitely that plays a role, right? The type of products that you actually are on display. The less items they show, the more shoppers are forced to think that there is not many of them available. That's a very good point. Anton says, this talk and spreadsheet example relates to my last gig working at JP Morgan as a lead UX designer. It was a challenge to get the enterprise users to get away from the spreadsheet crowded mentality. But we were eventually successful by using hierarchy, progressive disclosure, and proper data visualization, as well as customization options. That's really good to hear. That's great to hear, Anton. I think that's the challenge, right? I mean, because sometimes, again, users don't always know what they want. And if you just give them what they are more used to, that's what they're gonna excel. I mean, that's more comfortable for them, right? And all of us human beings care about comfort. We don't want to challenge ourselves in ways that are gonna spend more time and more calories, right? So, but sometimes a new thing might be actually better for them and save them time. So it's a little bit of a give and take, right? It's sometimes you have to understand the task, understand the user, their context, right? What they are, what kind of tools they are more used to. But at the same time, you have to, as it's your role as a designer, to really push the boundary on what is really best for that specific experience and prove it to them, right? Show to them and talk to them and having that proper conversation. I think it can actually bear a great amount of results for sure. Great. Caroline says, I always come back to my main rule, understand the user and the tasks. Yes, it seems like a bit of a cliche, but it is true. Great. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. So I think we are at the end of the talk. This is great. We are just over 30 minutes. This is kind of the role, is that we have these things and for that and for these sessions to be pretty short, right? Around 30 minutes each. And I will be posting this video on YouTube after this, at some point this week. And I'm looking forward to see all of you next week, next Wednesday at the same time. And again, I'm not going to say what the principle we're going to discuss, but I look forward to having many of you there. All right. Thank you so much. And stay safe. See you, everyone.